Welcome to this session. We're diving into the fascinating dynamics of how a political myth has shaped Cambodia's experience with international intervention, especially looking at how the international community has been imagined as caring, powerful, and sometimes even disingenuous.
I'm really excited to unpack this. So, we're talking about a myth, right? Not a fairy tale, but a narrative process that's been built up over decades in Cambodia.
Exactly. It's like the paper frames the international community as a political myth, a living, evolving narrative that started notably during the UNTAC period in the early 90s when the UN set up a liberal peace experiment.
Yeah.
At that time, it was all about establishing a democratic order amid chaos.
Right, and UNTAC's rhetoric was almost legendary, promising that a watchful and caring international force would rescue Cambodia. It's almost like a benevolent superpower narrative.
Absolutely, it was systematically built. They used radio broadcasts and public appeals to stir up the idea that the international community not only existed, but also had a unique moral obligation towards Cambodians. It was conveyed as this near-miraculous force that could bring peace and prosperity.
So, in essence, the myth wasn't just about a set of actions, but about creating a shared sense of, destiny and collective responsibility?
Exactly right. The study shows that the myth worked as a cohesive narrative. It integrated local and international spheres by assigning agentic properties to this international community. It's like the idea itself became a sort of glue, uniting diverse political and civil society actors around a common ideal of democratic transformation.
I love that analogy, glue that holds everything together. But doesn't that also mask some of the deeper power imbalances? I mean, the narrative portrays everything as unified when in reality, aren't different groups using it in very different ways?
Great point. The article does note that while traditional actors would rally behind this myth to legitimize democratic processes, a new generation of progressive Cambodian actors is now challenging it. They argue that this myth has, over time, become, how shall we say, rigid and overly dependent on external validation.
So it's like, while the myth originally mobilized people for liberal peace, in more recent times it's becoming less effective for achieving the kind of political change these actors want dearly?
Yes, precisely. In the post-liberal age, we've seen that the international community, once described as all-powerful and ever-watchful, is now critiqued as indecisive or even partisan. Actors on the ground are increasingly skeptical of its ability to deliver on those lofty promises. Essentially, what was once seen as a safeguard for democracy is now seen as a relic that doesn't align with the country's realities.
I find it intriguing how the paper discusses the myth as a, living process, you know? It's not static. It's continuously retold, reworked, and even contested through different historical moments and political contexts.
Exactly. It's that cyclical character that's so compelling. The myth was produced during UNTAC, then it was reinforced during subsequent legal and aid interventions, and finally, in the post-liberal phase, it gets contested. Actors are now using the same narrative tools to contest the status quo and push for a new relationship with the international community.
Speaking of contested narratives, the paper highlights that by framing the international community as almost a singular, unchallengeable entity, it allows both government and opposition groups to weaponize this idea for different political ends, right?
Yes, exactly. Government officials, for example, have exploited this narrative to forge legitimacy, invoking the community as a sort of ultimate judge in their favor. Meanwhile, the opposition, especially after events like the dissolution of the CNRP in 2017, have used it both to question legitimacy and, to demand greater international scrutiny.
Right. That creates such a dramatic tension. It's like a tug of war between invoking the international community as a guardian versus calling it out for its, shortcomings.
Yes, and what's particularly interesting is that the myth has its own momentum. It's almost self-fulfilling. Once people buy into this narrative, any political move gets filtered through that lens, reinforcing both expectations and disappointments.
Yeah,
The myth doesn't just describe reality, it shapes it.
I see what you mean. But then, don't you think relying so heavily on a myth might actually prevent more grounded political analysis? I mean, if everyone takes these narratives for granted, where's the space for, say, rigorous critique?
That's a valid concern. The authors actually argue that while these narratives helped mobilize support, they're also problematic because they obscure the messy, contradictory nature of political change. In other words, the myth can mask real issues like dependency on foreign aid or the limitations of liberal peace-building strategies.
Yeah. So, in a way, this myth has a double-edged quality. It unites and inspires, but it can also conflate differing interests and hinder genuine reform.
Exactly. And as you pointed out earlier, the way it's been reappropriated by local actors now indicates a growing disillusionment. They're saying, look, the international community isn't this omnipotent savior anymore. It's become a, weak link that sometimes even bolsters an authoritarian regime.
Right. There's this clear sense that the legendary aura of the international community is fading, and the critics are pushing for a renegotiation, an arrangement where Cambodia's own agency is recognized rather than being continuously dependent on external validation.
Exactly. It's a call to redefine the relationship. The article points out that the very same narratives which once evoked universal solidarity are now being seen as a cloak for, outdated interventionist practices. The retelling of the myth has changed, reflecting a more, let's say, critical stance towards external political influence.
What I find fascinating is that this narrative transformation is not just theoretical, it's rooted in concrete events: the 1993 election, the UN peace efforts, and more recently, the 2018 election crisis and international responses to it.
Absolutely. Each of these episodes, like the dramatic promissory tone during UNTAC and the subsequent disillusionment after the 2018 elections, serves as a kind of milestone. They help trace how the myth has evolved and how its promises have shifted, or even failed, to resonate with the local realities.
And the methodology behind this research is no small feat. The article draws from decades of archival research, interviews, observations, spanning multiple languages: Khmer, English, French, and different regions of Cambodia. That gives a really rich, nuanced picture of how these ideas circulate.
Right. It's a comprehensive effort. The authors even discuss how metaphors and symbols, like a caring international community or the watchful eyes of foreign powers, get reified through state media and public rhetoric. It's like, these images then become part of the everyday political language in Cambodia.
That language is so powerful because it creates, a shared historical consciousness, even if that consciousness is in some ways built on myth rather than verifiable fact.
Yes, and interestingly, the paper challenges us to think about the implications this has on our understanding of global political orders. It's not just about Cambodia. It's a reminder that myths can act as both the adhesive and the Achilles heel in political systems.
Exactly. So, to wrap up, if I understand correctly, the major takeaway is that while myths like that of the international community can mobilize political action and legitimize intervention, they also risk becoming outdated. And when they do, they might actually contribute to a kind of political decay or misalignment with current realities.
That's right. The myth's ambivalence. It both inspires hope and creates dependency, forces us to reconsider how political narratives are constructed. And importantly, it shows that the language of international solidarity can be as much a barrier as it is a bridge to meaningful change.
Such a deeply layered analysis indeed. It makes us reflect on how historical narratives shape and sometimes limit our political futures.
Exactly. And as a final thought, it's a call for scholars and practitioners alike to engage critically with these narratives, challenging them when necessary, and seeking new frameworks that better capture the evolving dynamics of global political engagement.
Yeah.
It's a fascinating dance between myth and reality.
Well, this has been an incredibly engaging discussion. I'm sure our listeners are walking away with a fresh perspective on how myths, like that of the international community, continue to influence not just Cambodia, but global politics at large.
Absolutely. Thanks for joining in on this exploration. It's been as dynamic and evolving as the myth itself.